On the final day of 2006, Britain transferred $83 million to Washington. This payment closed a chapter that opened 60 years earlier, in the aftermath of the Second World War. For 6 decades, British citizens had been funding a debt incurred not in defeat, but in victory. Most people assume this money paid for winning the war against fascism. The truth is far more complex and troubling. What actually happened between 1940 and 1945 represents one of history's most significant wealth redistributions, carried out not through military force but through financial maneuvering. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, it commanded the largest empire the world had ever seen, held enormous gold reserves, and functioned as the planet's financial hub. 6 years later, Britain emerged victorious but economically devastated, having surrendered its gold, liquidated centuries of accumulated wealth, granted strategic territories for nearly a century, and accumulated $31 billion in American debt. Adjusted for inflation, that equals roughly $486 billion in contemporary terms. The real price, however, wasn't measured in currency but in global influence. The British Empire, which had dominated world affairs for generations, effectively ceased to exist as an independent economic force. This transformation didn't occur by accident or as an unfortunate side effect of war. It was engineered with deliberate precision by American financial authorities while Britain fought desperately against Nazi aggression. The mechanics of this transfer, the assets Britain was compelled to surrender, the beneficiaries of these forced sales, the abrupt termination of assistance immediately following Japan's capitulation, and the 1946 financial agreement that eliminated Britain's remaining economic autonomy all form part of this remarkable story. Grasping these events matters beyond historical curiosity. It reveals the mechanisms through which dominant powers establish and preserve their positions, not through traditional conquest, but through financial leverage, mandatory liquidations, and extracting value from partners during their most vulnerable moments. The strategies applied to Britain in the early 1940s continue to shape international relations today. Let me walk you through exactly how this happened. In early December 1940, Winston Churchill composed what would become perhaps the most consequential letter of his tenure as Prime Minister. The recipient was Franklin Roosevelt, and the message opened with a frank assessment of Britain's military predicament. German submarines were destroying supply convoys crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The German Air Force was conducting nightly bombing campaigns against British population centers. Britain's armed forces desperately required equipment of every description: weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition. Then Churchill made an admission that must have pained him deeply. Britain's financial reserves were exhausted. Not merely strained or challenged, but completely depleted. The British government could no longer purchase American supplies with cash. After just 7 months of warfare, Britain had spent everything available. Educational curricula typically present this letter as a desperate appeal between friendly nations, the moment when Churchill sought Roosevelt's help against Hitler. But examine the actual content carefully. Churchill wasn't simply requesting assistance. He was negotiating the conditions under which Britain would be systematically stripped of its wealth. Before September 1939, Britain stood as the wealthiest nation on Earth. The British Empire encompassed more than 35 million square kilometers, nearly a quarter of the world's total land area. British investors held $22 billion in foreign assets, equivalent to approximately $450 billion in today's currency. British enterprises controlled transportation networks in South America, mining operations in Chile, rubber production in Southeast Asia, and petroleum extraction in Persia. London's financial district served as the center of global finance. The pound sterling functioned as the world's primary reserve currency. Britain possessed $6 billion in gold reserves, second only to the United States. Within 7 months of declaring war, all of this had vanished. The cause was straightforward. American policy demanded it. When Britain entered the war in September 1939, the United States maintained official neutrality. American public opinion strongly favored isolationism. Congress had enacted neutrality acts specifically designed to prevent American involvement in European conflicts. These laws contained a provision that would prove financially catastrophic for Britain: the cash and carry requirement. This regulation specified that nations at war could purchase American military supplies only under strict conditions. They had to pay entirely in cash before shipment, and they had to transport these goods using their own vessels. No credit arrangements, no deferred payment plans. Gold had to be physically transferred before any supplies left American ports. Britain had no alternative. The empire needed American industrial output: steel, petroleum, aircraft, and weapons. The factories of the American Midwest represented the only available source of supply at the necessary scale. So Britain paid everything it had. During an operation known as Operation Fish, initiated in June 1940, Britain loaded its entire national gold reserve onto warships and passenger vessels and transported it across the submarine-infested Atlantic to storage facilities in Canada and the United States. This represented the largest physical movement of wealth in recorded history: $7 billion in gold bars and financial securities. Britain's complete national treasure sent abroad to satisfy American payment demands. By November 1940, the gold was gone. Britain continued ordering supplies and signing contracts for aircraft and armored vehicles. But officials in London informed the British Purchasing Commission in Washington that no dollars remained to honor these obligations. Britain was 7 months into a conflict that would continue for 6 more years. The money had already run out. This is where the popular narrative about Lend-Lease begins to diverge from reality. According to the conventional story, Roosevelt wanted to assist Britain but faced domestic political resistance. So he developed Lend-Lease, a program under which America would provide equipment to Britain with the understanding that it would be returned after the war ended. Roosevelt explained this concept using a homespun metaphor. If your neighbor's house catches fire, you don't demand payment for lending him your garden hose. You provide the hose and he returns it once the fire is extinguished. It made for an appealing story. It also bore little resemblance to the truth. The actual terms of Lend-Lease were hammered out in confidential negotiations between the United States Treasury and increasingly desperate British representatives. The American leading these discussions was Henry Morgenthau Jr., who served as Treasury Secretary and Roosevelt's closest confidant. Morgenthau had no interest in simple garden hose analogies. His objective was to extract every valuable asset Britain possessed before authorizing a single dollar of assistance. In December 1940, before Congress had even approved Lend-Lease, Morgenthau insisted on a comprehensive accounting of the British Empire's wealth. He demanded a complete inventory of every asset owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere on the planet. Consider the implications of this demand. Britain was fighting for its existence against Nazi Germany. London was experiencing nightly aerial bombardment. And America's condition for providing aid was that Britain must open all its financial records to foreign inspection and demonstrate complete insolvency. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were shocked by these demands. Phillips pointed out that Britain had already surrendered its gold reserves. He explained that forcing the sale of long-term investments during wartime would result in catastrophic losses, with Britain receiving a fraction of their true value. He warned that stripping Britain of its overseas income sources would leave the country in permanent poverty after the war concluded. Morgenthau remained unmoved. His position was crystal clear. If Britain still possesses assets in America, American taxpayers shouldn't subsidize the war effort. Liquidate everything first, then we'll discuss assistance. Throughout January and February 1941, Congress debated the Lend-Lease proposal. Isolationist members argued that Britain was concealing wealth and attempting to manipulate America into financing its war. Morgenthau needed concrete proof that Britain was genuinely bankrupt. He needed a dramatic demonstration. He found his opportunity with American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest producer of rayon and synthetic silk in the United States. It was owned by Courtaulds, a British company. American Viscose was valued at over $100 million and generated $10 million annually in dividends that flowed back to London. Morgenthau instructed the British negotiators to sell American Viscose immediately and deposit the proceeds in the United States Treasury to pay for weapons already ordered. The British resisted. Selling American Viscose under wartime duress would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau issued an ultimatum: sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized American Viscose Corporation from its private owners using emergency war powers. It was a forced acquisition with no negotiation. The sale was managed by American investment banks who understood Britain had no bargaining position. They drove a brutal bargain. American Viscose sold for $54.4 million, approximately half its actual value. The British government compensated quartals and pounds within Britain, adding to Britain's domestic debt. The dollars from the sale went directly to the United States Treasury. This wasn't a transaction between allies. This was a foreclosure. America was liquidating British assets at distressed prices while Britain fought Hitler. But American viscose was merely the beginning. Morgenthau forced Britain to sell $650 million in United States securities and stocks held by British citizens. British-owned shares in American companies across every sector of the economy. Investment portfolios accumulated over generations. By mid-1941, Britain had liquidated $1.1 billion in American investments, equivalent to $22 billion in current dollars. The United States Treasury monitored every sale, verified the proceeds, and only after the liquidation was complete did Lend-Lease funds begin flowing. But the humiliation extended beyond financial assets. In September 1940, before Lend-Lease was even proposed, Britain had negotiated what became known as the Destroyers for Bases Exchange. Britain desperately needed destroyers to combat German submarines in the Atlantic. Roosevelt agreed to provide Britain with 50 obsolete destroyers from World War I that were sitting in storage. These were outdated, deteriorating vessels that the United States Navy had no use for. In exchange, Britain granted the United States 99-year leases on military installations in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, and British Guiana. Consider the asymmetry of this trade. Britain gave America strategic control over the entire Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean region, and the North Atlantic for nearly a century in exchange for 50 obsolete vessels. These bases enabled the United States to project military force across the Atlantic Ocean. They became the cornerstone of American hemispheric dominance, and Britain surrendered them for ships that barely functioned. It was the geopolitical equivalent of selling the family estate to buy groceries. The Lend-Lease Act passed Congress on March 11, 1941. It authorized $7 billion initially, eventually expanding to $50 billion for all allied nations. For Britain specifically, $31 billion in aid over 4 years. The propaganda machinery called it the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt proclaimed that America would become the great supplier of weapons to defeat tyranny. And Lend-Lease did keep Britain in the fight. Without American supplies, Britain would have been forced into submission through starvation. But Lend-Lease was never a gift, it was a lease arrangement. The very name reveals the underlying truth. Britain was leasing American equipment with the understanding that there would eventually be an accounting. And buried within the Lend-Lease Agreement was Article 7, a clause that would ultimately destroy the British Empire. Article 7 required that in exchange for aid, Britain must agree to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce after the war ended. This sounds innocuous. Free trade. Open markets. But discriminatory treatment was code language for imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic framework that held the British Empire together. It was a tariff system where British goods received preferential pricing in empire markets compared to foreign goods. Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa all purchased British products because British products enjoyed preferential rates. This system protected British industry from American competition. American automobiles were superior. American machinery was more efficient. But in empire markets, British goods were cheaper because of the tariff structure. Article 7 required Britain to dismantle imperial preference after the war. Britain had to demolish its own economic protective barriers and allow American companies to compete freely in empire markets. The British negotiators understood exactly what this meant. It was the death certificate of the empire as an economic entity. But German bombers were overhead. Submarines were sinking supply convoys in the Atlantic. Britain signed the agreement. Britain fought World War II using American equipment, paid for by liquidating its empire and promising to dismantle whatever remained. As the war continued through 1942, 1943, and 1944, the wealth transfer accelerated. American industry experienced unprecedented growth. United States GDP expanded 75% during the war years. American factories produced weapons for the war effort while simultaneously manufacturing consumer goods for global markets. Britain, meanwhile, converted every factory to war production. Britain stopped exporting entirely. British companies abandoned markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Who filled those vacant markets? American companies. While British factories manufactured fighter aircraft, American factories manufactured fighter aircraft plus refrigerators, radios, automobiles, and tractors for the entire world. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously capturing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer was complete. Global gold reserves had shifted from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had moved permanently across the Atlantic. But Britain believed the sacrifice would be honored. British officials believed that because Britain had fought alone for 2 years, because Britain had bankrupted itself to defeat Hitler, America would be generous after the war. They were mistaken. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In London, crowds celebrated outside Buckingham Palace. The war was won. 7 days later, on August 21, 1945, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9620. Lend-Lease was terminated immediately and completely. American supply ships in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean were ordered to reverse course and return to the United States. No transition period, no grace period. The lifeline was severed. The British government was stunned. They had assumed aid would continue during Reconstruction. The British economy had been entirely distorted for war production. Factories needed to be converted back to civilian manufacturing. That conversion takes time. Britain was importing half its food and nearly all its raw materials, paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain faced starvation. John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of his generation, calculated that Britain faced what he called a financial Dunkirk. Within months, Britain would have to default on payments, stop importing food, and implement rationing at starvation levels. There was only one option. Britain had to request a loan. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington. He was 62 years old, suffering from heart disease that would kill him within months. He was traveling to America not as an intellectual equal, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral argument. Britain had fought alone for 2 years while America remained neutral. Britain had sacrificed its entire economy for Western civilization. Therefore, America should provide Britain with a grant of $6 billion. Not a loan, a gift. Retroactive payment for the sacrifice. Keynes called it justice. But when Keynes arrived in Washington, he discovered that justice wasn't a currency the Americans recognized. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were unmoved by Keynes's moral appeals. The war was over. The American public was exhausted with paying for Europe. Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, which had been elected on a platform of nationalizing industries. The Americans offered a loan, not a grant. $3.75 billion at 2% interest. It was barely sufficient to survive. And it came with conditions designed to destroy what remained of British economic independence. The most devastating condition was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that 1 year after receiving a loan, Britain must make the pound fully convertible. This meant anyone holding British pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for United States dollars. The Americans framed this as free trade, but it was a trap. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies to accept payments in pounds, but had forbidden them from converting pounds to dollars. This created a closed economic loop. Countries like India, Australia, and Egypt had pounds but could only spend them on British goods. This system protected British industry. But the Americans wanted it destroyed. They knew that if the pound became convertible, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell them to purchase dollars, because American goods were superior and everyone wanted American products. Keynes knew this condition would destroy Britain. He fought against it until his health collapsed. But the alternative was starvation. Britain had no choice. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died in April 1946, his heart failing under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in British history. Blizzards buried the country. Coal supplies froze. Power stations shut down. People shivered in unheated homes. And in the middle of this frozen misery, the deadline arrived on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound sterling convertible as required by the loan agreement. The result was catastrophic. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries holding sterling for years unloaded it for dollars. In 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars from the loan. The hemorrhage was so severe that after just 5 weeks, on August 20th, 1947, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. Britain had burned through a quarter of the loan in 5 weeks for nothing. The humiliation was absolute. This financial collapse had immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, Britain sent a telegram to the United States State Department. For a century, Britain had been the protector of Greece and Turkey, preventing Soviet influence in the Mediterranean. The telegram said, "We can no longer afford it. We are withdrawing. If you want to stop the communists, you must do it yourselves." This triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in to fill the vacuum. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant, Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. But the final humiliation was the debt itself. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was not forgiven. It was a commercial debt with 2% annual interest. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the economic boom of the 1950s, the inflation of the 1970s, the Thatcher privatizations and the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 61 years after victory. So who benefited from this extraction? Let me show you the names. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Treasury Secretary, orchestrated the liquidation. After the war, Morgenthau remained wealthy and influential. He never faced consequences for stripping an ally during its darkest hour. The American banks that handled the forced sale of British assets earned millions in fees. J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs all facilitated the liquidation and profited from the desperation. American corporations that purchased British assets at fire sale prices made fortunes. American Viscose, bought for $54 million, was worth over $100 million. The buyers doubled their money instantly. The military-industrial complex that supplied Lend-Lease equipment, Boeing, Lockheed, Ford, General Motors, all were paid by the United States government, which billed Britain. These companies made billions from the war while Britain went bankrupt buying their products. And the United States government itself. By 1945, the United States held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. American military bases circled the globe. The United States had achieved global dominance not through conquest but through debt. The British Empire wasn't conquered, it was purchased. The United States acquired the assets, the bases, the markets, and the geopolitical influence through a distressed asset sale managed by the United States Treasury. This wasn't unique to Britain. The same playbook has been used on every American ally since 1945. After World War II, Germany was rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, but Marshall Plan aid came with conditions. Germany had to open its markets to American goods, host American military bases, and align its foreign policy with Washington. By the 1950s, Germany was prosperous but dependent. Japan, after 1945, was occupied and restructured. The Japanese economy was rebuilt with American aid, but Japan became a protectorate. United States military bases in Japan remain today. Japan holds over $1 trillion in United States Treasury bonds. Japan cannot pursue independent foreign policy without American approval. South Korea, after the Korean War, United States military presence, United States economic influence. South Korea is wealthy but strategically dependent on American protection. The pattern repeats. Crisis creates dependency. Dependency requires concessions. Concessions transfer wealth and sovereignty to the United States. Britain in 1940 wasn't conquered by Germany. It was conquered by the United States using debt, forced liquidations, and contractual clauses disguised as alliance. The mythology of World War II teaches that America saved Britain. The reality is that America bought Britain, and Britain paid for decades. Understanding this isn't about hatred or historical revisionism. It's about seeing how power actually functions. Empires aren't built through obvious conquest anymore. They're built through finance, debt, and crisis management. When your ally is desperate, when the bombs are falling, when starvation is imminent, that's when you extract concessions. That's when you force the liquidation. That's when you rewrite the terms. The special relationship between the United States and United Kingdom is celebrated as an alliance of equals. But read the documents. Look at the numbers. Britain gave everything. America took everything. In December 1940, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt requesting aid. In doing so, he signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no choice. But the cost was the future. Britain defeated Hitler but lost the empire. Britain won the war but was bankrupted by its ally. And 3 generations of British taxpayers paid America for the privilege of surviving. The Lend-Lease Agreement wasn't the arsenal of democracy. It was the greatest asset-stripping operation in history, executed with legal precision while Britain was fighting for its life. If this showed you how alliances really work, subscribe. Because the same playbook used on Britain in 1941 is being used right now. The dollar as reserve currency. The debt trap of United States Treasury bonds. The military bases that ensure dependency. It's all the same mechanism.